"You call that a life, old man? Polishing rust and nursing lukewarm coffee." Marcus Thorne's voice, honed by years of boardroom pronouncements, sliced through the morning quiet of the old mill diner. Silas Thorne, his back to the room, didn't flinch. His gnarled fingers, stained with years of grease and earth, continued their slow, deliberate polish of the tarnished brass bell by the counter, a ritual as old as the diner itself. A faded, patched fishing vest, smelling faintly of lake water and forgotten summers, hung loosely on his thin shoulders, an insult to Marcus's tailored suit and gleaming smartwatch. Silas Thorne, a man etched by time and quiet solitude, was as much a part of the old mill diner as the chipped enamel on its counter stools. At 78, every line on his face told a story, every tremor in his hands hinted at a past carefully guarded. He arrived precisely at 6 a.m., before even Dolores, the diner's perpetually tired owner, had fully flicked on the fluorescent lights. His order never varied. Black coffee, a single unbuttered biscuit, and the morning paper, folded precisely to the obituaries. He didn't read them for morbid curiosity, but for names, for connections to a Havenwood that was slowly fading, much like the paint on the diner's sign. Havenwood itself was a town caught in amber, a relic of forgotten industry. The textile mills had closed decades ago, leaving behind skeletal brick structures and a lingering scent of dust and despair. What remained were the people, resilient, weary, and bound by a shared understanding of loss. Silas was one of them, yet apart. He lived in a small, clapboard house on the edge of town, near the overgrown banks of the Willow Creek. His days were a quiet rhythm of tending his small garden, mending broken things for neighbors, and his morning pilgrimage to the old mill. He often thought about the creek, its ceaseless flow a stark contrast to the stagnant air of the abandoned factories. Everything changes, he'd muse, but some things, like the river, just keep on moving, carving their own path. The fishing vest he wore wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was a second skin. Its pockets bulged with an assortment of small utilitarian objects. A well-worn Swiss Army knife, a spool of fishing line, a handful of smooth river stones, and, tucked deep in an inner pocket, a single meticulously carved wooden fishing lure. It wasn't painted, just polished to a deep, dark sheen, its contours strangely angular, unlike any lure Silas had ever seen for sale. He'd often run his thumb over its smooth surface, a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible, a private communion with a memory only he carried. Some things, he thought, you don't just hold in your hand. You hold them in your heart. The other regulars, the grizzled mill workers and the few remaining farmers, offered Silas respectful nods. They knew not to pry. There was a quiet strength about him, an unspoken gravity that commanded a deference deeper than any rank or title. Dolores kept his coffee cup perpetually full, even on the busiest mornings. Young Jimmy, the busboy, always made sure his favorite booth by the window was clean. They didn't know why they respected him, only that it felt right. He was Havenwood's quiet anchor, a living testament to an enduring spirit. He often felt their eyes on him, not with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement. They see something, he'd think, even if they don't know what it is. Marcus Thorne, no relation to Silas beyond a shared surname and a universe of differences, had blown into Havenwood 2 years prior like a chrome-plated tornado. He bought up the old, abandoned textile mill, promising a tech startup that would revolutionize local industry. His words were as slick as his perfectly gelled hair, his suits as sharp as his business acumen. He spoke of synergy and disruption, phrases that felt alien in the dusty air of the old mill diner. He had an app for everything, a solution for every problem, and an opinion on every subject, especially those he knew nothing about. Empty vessels make the most noise, Silas often thought, a quiet proverb echoing in his mind. Marcus was a self-proclaimed veteran. His stories, often delivered at a volume that made Dolores wince, detailed a brief, non-combat stint in the Air Force as a logistics specialist, a role he inflated into tales of strategic genius and unparalleled efficiency. He'd flash photos on his phone. Himself, grinning, shaking hands with obscure colonels at base functions. He craved recognition, validation, a spotlight that the quiet humility of Havenwood often denied him. He'd often catch Silas's eye, a challenge in his gaze, as if daring the old man to question his fabricated heroism. He saw Silas as an anachronism, a relic. That worn fishing vest, the quiet routine, the refusal to engage in boastful banter. It grated on Marcus. It was an affront to his carefully constructed image of progress and success. "Some people just don't evolve," he'd murmur, loud enough for half the diner to hear, gesturing vaguely towards Silas. "Stuck in the past. No ambition, no drive. How can you expect a town to thrive when its own people refuse to embrace the future?" He'd then launch into a diatribe about digital natives versus analog dinosaurs, never missing an opportunity to subtly belittle Silas. Silas never responded. He'd simply turn another page of his newspaper or take a slow sip of his coffee. His silence, to Marcus, was an admission of guilt, a confirmation of his own superiority. It fed a smug confidence, a dangerous certainty that he was the only one who truly understood what it meant to contribute. "He's a storm in a teacup," Silas would think, all bluster, no depth. He had seen real storms, real bluster, and they didn't make a sound like this. The jabs grew sharper. Marcus, feeling emboldened by Silas's unwavering silence, escalated his public critiques. One blustery Tuesday, as rain lashed against the diner windows, Marcus launched into a particularly cutting monologue about personal branding and presenting oneself. "Look at that old vest, for God's sake," Marcus scoffed, his voice carrying over the clatter of plates. "It's practically falling apart. A man should take pride in his appearance, especially a veteran. It's about respect for the uniform even after you hang it up. Or, well, I suppose some of us hung it up with distinction." He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air. "It's a reflection of your discipline, your commitment. Not everyone gets that, I suppose. Some just fade away." Dolores, wiping down the counter, paused, her rag hovering over a coffee stain. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Marcus and the silent figure of Silas. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Silas, as always, remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. He folded his newspaper with deliberate slowness, a quiet act of defiance. He placed a few coins on the table, his usual tip, always generous despite his meager means, a silent acknowledgement of Dolores's tireless work. The cost of his late wife's long illness still weighed heavy, but some debts, he knew, were measured in kindness, not dollars. She would have understood, he thought, remembering Martha's gentle smile. She always understood the quiet language of respect. Silas pushed himself up from the booth, his joints creaking a quiet protest. He moved with the careful precision of an old machine, each movement considered. As he reached the diner door, Marcus's voice, sharper than ever, pierced the strained silence. "Where are you off to, Silas? Back to your little hovel to count your rusty fishing hooks? You're a monument to stagnation, old man. A disgrace to any notion of progress." Marcus's laugh was a brittle, unpleasant sound. "You're a disgrace to all of us, Silas. Just look at yourself." Silas stopped, his hand on the cold brass handle. He turned, slowly, his eyes, usually distant, meeting Marcus's for a fleeting moment. There was no anger there, no challenge, just a profound, ancient weariness, a depth that swallowed Marcus's petty insults whole. He said nothing. He simply pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling a mournful tune, and stepped out into the biting rain. Marcus smiled, a triumphant, self-satisfied smirk. He believed he had won. He had put the old man in his place. He had no idea he had just humiliated a man who carried more courage in his quiet heart than Marcus could ever conjure in a lifetime of grand pronouncements. He seized the surface, Silas thought as the rain hit his face. He never looks beneath. What Marcus, and most of Havenwood, didn't know was Silas's true daily ritual. Every afternoon, after his quiet breakfast and tending his garden, Silas made his way to the Havenwood Public Library. It wasn't much of a library anymore. The town council had cut its funding years ago, the roof leaked, and the heating rarely worked. Most days it stood dark and locked. But Silas had a key. He was the unofficial, unpaid, unacknowledged caretaker. Someone has to remember, he'd tell himself as he unlocked the heavy oak door. Someone has to keep the light on. He didn't just dust shelves. He patched holes in the roof with tar he bought from his own pension. He meticulously repaired broken spines of forgotten books, the ones no one checked out anymore but held the history of Havenwood in their brittle pages. He replaced flickering light bulbs, cleaned the grime from the tall, arched windows, and, most importantly, he tended to the wall of names. This was Silas's private sanctuary, an entire section of one wall dedicated to Havenwood's fallen soldiers. Not a grand monument, just simple, handwritten names on faded index cards, tucked into clear plastic sleeves. Names from the Great War, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq. Silas knew them all. He'd spend hours there, polishing the dusty glass, replacing a card if it had faded too much, sometimes just standing, staring at the names. He'd bring fresh wildflowers from his garden, placing them in a small, chipped vase beneath the names of those who never came home. It was his way of keeping their stories alive, a silent vigil against the creeping amnesia of time. They deserved more than to be forgotten. He'd whisper to the silent names. They deserved to be remembered. And the lure, the small, strangely angular wooden lure he always kept in his vest pocket. It was more than a memento. It was a fragment of a forgotten history, a piece of a story so extraordinary, so improbable, that Silas had never dared to speak it aloud. Its smooth, worn surface held the weight of an impossible task, a desperate gambit in a war that had left scars deeper than any bullet wound. He'd often feel its familiar weight against his chest, a constant, silent reminder of a promise kept, of lives saved, and of a secret buried deep. Veterans Day arrived, crisp and cold, painting Havenwood in shades of muted gold and brittle brown. The annual ceremony was held, as always, in the town square, a small gathering of familiar faces. Marcus Thorne, resplendent in a freshly pressed suit, stood near the front, nodding sagely at the mayor's platitudes. He'd even brought a drone, hovering above the crowd, capturing historical footage for his company's social media. Silas, as always, was in the back, almost hidden by the skeletal branches of an old maple tree, his worn fishing vest a muted counterpoint to the vibrant flags. He felt the familiar pull of melancholy, the bittersweet remembrance of faces long gone. This year, however, there was a special guest. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned military historian, whose books on forgotten special operations units were bestsellers. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a quiet intensity that belied her academic demeanor. She had come to Havenwood researching a specific, almost mythical unit known only as the Ghost Hawks. Their existence and their singular, impossible mission during the Vietnam War had only recently been declassified. Dr. Reed spoke with a measured cadence, her voice cutting through the autumn air. She spoke of courage, of sacrifice, and of the unsung heroes whose deeds were lost to time and secrecy. As she spoke, her gaze swept over the small crowd, an academic's habit of observation, searching for a face, a gesture, a fragment of the past. And then she saw him, Silas Thorne, in his faded fishing vest, his hands gently turning something in his pocket. A flicker of movement, a glint of polished wood. Dr. Reed paused mid-sentence. Her eyes narrowed, focusing. She saw the distinctive, angular shape of the object Silas was absently fondling. It was unmistakable. She'd seen drawings of it, mentioned in declassified reports as a unique, non-standard field device. She deviated from her prepared speech. Ladies and gentlemen, her voice took on a new urgency. I came here today to speak of forgotten valor, of a unit so clandestine, so effective, their very existence was a whisper. The Ghost Hawks, a small, elite team, tasked with operations considered suicidal. They earned the Presidential Unit Citation for an act of unparalleled bravery in the Mekong Delta, an act that turned the tide of a critical engagement. Their mission involved the demolition of a heavily guarded bridge, a task deemed impossible without massive casualties. Marcus Thorne, preening in the front row, puffed out his chest, imagining the general was about to praise his administrative prowess, perhaps even offer him a lucrative contract. But Dr. Reed's eyes remained fixed on Silas. "The intelligence reports," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet power, "mention a unique, improvised distraction, a single hand-carved wooden lure, used to draw enemy fire to simulate a diversion, allowing the main demolition team to plant their charges undetected. It was a mad, brilliant stroke of genius, a piece of folk art turned into a weapon of war, a decoy so convincing, it bought the precious minutes needed for the impossible to become reality." She stepped down from the makeshift stage, her gaze never leaving Silas. The crowd murmured, confused. Marcus's triumphant smile faltered, replaced by a look of dawning horror. Dr. Reed walked slowly, deliberately, through the rows of chairs, towards the old man in the back. "Sergeant Thorne?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it resonated through the square. "Silas Thorne? Of the Ghost Hawks?" Silas looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and ancient weariness. He slowly, reluctantly, pulled the wooden lure from his pocket. Its unique shape caught the weak sunlight, a silent, powerful testament. Dr. Reed nodded, a profound respect etched on her face. Then, she did something unexpected. She saluted, a crisp, military salute, sharp and unwavering. One by one, the quiet murmurs ceased. The mayor, the pastor, the high school band members, even the children, slowly rose to their feet. And then, as if by instinct, they too began to salute. A ripple of recognition, of awe, spread through the small crowd. Marcus Thorne stood frozen, his arm half raised, a rictus of shock on his face. He looked at Silas, then at the lure, then back at Silas, the pieces of his carefully constructed world shattering around him. "This can't be real," he thought, his mind racing. "This old man?" Silas, still holding the lure, slowly, almost imperceptibly, returned Dr. Reed's salute. His eyes, for a moment, held the distant, haunted look of a man who had seen too much, done too much, and asked for nothing in return. The truth, when it finally revealed itself, had the power to change everything. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of a weight that had finally been acknowledged. That night, Marcus Thorne didn't sleep. The image of Dr. Reed saluting Silas, the quiet dignity of the old man, the strange, carved lure, it all spun in his mind like a broken compass. Every arrogant word he'd uttered, every dismissive glance, every boast about his own trivial contributions, now echoed as a hollow, mocking laugh. He, Marcus Thorne, the self-proclaimed titan of industry, the veteran with his polished shoes and empty stories, had publicly shamed a man who had faced death, saved lives, and carried the weight of true heroism with silent humility. The shame was a physical ache in his chest, a burning in his gut. I was wrong. So wrong. The next morning, Marcus was at the Old Mill Diner before dawn. He sat at a table near Silas's usual corner, not touching his untouched coffee. He listened. Dolores was telling Sarah, the retired schoolteacher, about Silas. "Did you know he's the one who's been fixing the library roof? And the heat? All from his own pocket. And those flowers by the wall of names? He puts them there every week, rain or shine." Mike, the burly mechanic, chimed in. "And my boy, Timmy, fell through the ice on Willow Creek last winter. Silas, he jumped right in, pulled him out. Didn't even wait for thanks, just vanished. Just like he always does." Marcus listened, a knot tightening in his stomach. The quiet acts of service, the unspoken generosity, the profound, everyday courage. It was a stark contrast to his own carefully curated image. He remembered his cruel words about Silas's lack of ambition, his stagnation. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth, like ash. He built something real, something that matters, and I built a nothing but noise. At precisely 6 a.m., Silas Thorne walked in. He moved with his usual quiet grace, his worn fishing vest a familiar sight. He nodded to Dolores, made his way to his booth. He didn't glance at Marcus. His routine was his anchor, his quiet rebellion against a world that demanded constant performance. Marcus finished his coffee, leaving a $20 bill on the table, more than he'd ever tipped in his life. He walked out, a single burning truth etched in his heart. Some mistakes were too vast to be fixed with mere words, but you still had to try. At 8 a.m., Marcus stood on Silas's porch. The small, white-clapboard house, neat but unassuming, seemed to mock his own sprawling, modern monstrosity on the hill. He knocked. No answer. A neighbor, an elderly woman tending her rose bushes, looked up, a knowing smile on her face. "Looking for Silas?" she asked kindly. "He'll be at the library. Saturdays he's always there. Takes care of the place, you know. Keeps it alive." Marcus drove to the Havenwood Public Library. It looked different now. Not just a derelict building, but a quiet sanctuary, a testament to one man's unwavering devotion. He pushed open the heavy wooden door. The scent of old paper and dust, mingled with the faint fragrance of fresh wildflowers, filled the air. Silas was kneeling by the wall of names, carefully wiping dust from a faded index card. He stood slowly, turned, and saw Marcus. There was no surprise in his eyes, only that familiar, ancient weariness, a hint of something unreadable. "Silas," Marcus began, his voice thick with unaccustomed humility. He cleared his throat, his usual eloquence deserting him. I came to ask for forgiveness. For everything I said, everything I thought." Silas picked up another soft cloth, turning back to the wall. "No need," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of malice or triumph. "There is," Marcus insisted, stepping closer, his hands awkwardly clasped. "I spent 2 years humiliating you, thinking I was better. I thought I was the one who mattered, the one who contributed. But the truth is, I was standing in front of the greatest man in this town, and I was too blind to see it." He gestured vaguely at the wall of names, then at Silas's vest, at the lure peeking from his pocket. You risked your life. You keep the memory of these men alive. You saved children from freezing water. And I mocked your clothes, your quiet dignity." His voice trailed off, raw with genuine shame. "I'm sorry, Silas. Truly sorry." Silas paused, looked at Marcus. His eyes, for a moment, held a flicker of something akin to understanding, perhaps even a hint of pity. "I only did what needed to be done," he said, his gaze returning to the wall. "And I still do." He resumed polishing the names, one by one, each stroke a quiet act of devotion. Marcus stood beside him, silent, respectful. The air was thick with unspoken apologies, with the weight of revelation. He looked at the names on the wall, truly saw them for the first time, not as a historian's abstract data, but as lives, sacrifices, stories. Can I help?" Marcus finally managed, his voice barely a whisper, an echo of his earlier, arrogant question. Silas stopped, picked up a clean cloth from his canvas bag. He handed it to Marcus. "Start on that side," he said, a faint, almost imperceptible curve at the corner of his lips. "They all have stories that deserve to be remembered." The two men worked side by side for the rest of the morning, in the quiet, dusty hall of the Havenwood Public Library. Because sometimes the greatest lessons are the ones never spoken. And sometimes the greatest victory is turning an enemy into a friend, not through the power of force, but through the quiet, unyielding strength of example.